Okay, welcome back, fellow human beings. We still want to read about Hegel's concept of absolute spirit, and especially the article of Hermann van Erp. But just, this is a very cheesy background picture, right? But yeah, that was when I was in Hong Kong, and in fact, I was using a ferry and reading Hegel while crossing that ocean. Well, so much for a philosopher that also has a practical life. But let's get back to the text. So we really want to understand what is spirit about, right? This kind of religious entity where a hardcore atheist says, no, God does not exist, leave me alone with your spirits. But on a practical level, we can accept that we deal with other persons in terms of spirits. So it's more a term that is relative to the community of people describing what we cannot maybe yet describe in naturalistic terms. But that's a big question, right? Like many people say, yeah, we cannot explain that yet, but we will, right? That's a bit optimistic. And so, yeah, in that regard, I suggest that we dive into the text, analyzing more what this spirit is about. So we see here it is about the time of spirit and natural time. So, and let's keep in mind, what is natural time? So natural time is a very strict order on a clock that we as human beings produce as a measurement. It does not necessarily exist. And I think as human beings, we understand our lives way more according to a time, a spiritual time. That means I think of my childhood and I think of certain events like a birthday party, my time in kindergarten, first day in school, maybe my graduation ceremony. And we order our lives regarding these significant events. And also when we think about like measuring our life in terms of years, we do that according to the repetition of seasons. The fact that Earth is turning in a very unordered way around the sun. So in that sense, life is way more important, and the time that originates from that life is what really gives us meaning and maybe also guides us in producing something that is natural time. So let's look a little bit more on this, at this concept of life. So in the concept of life, nature falls asunder into a mass of individuals and processes ending in death, so that none of them can express themselves as an actual totality. And yeah, what we have with the merely organic life is that life is just producing itself, but never really going beyond itself. With humans, that changes. So he says here also, for this sort of life, the species cannot exist for itself. It can express itself only in the plurality of finite individuals, in which it seems to lose its inner unity or identity. And Hegel calls this die Ohnmacht der Natur, the impotence of nature, to maintain the severity of this, or the discipline of the concept. And then, of course, we have spirit that is able to return into itself and produce itself, result from itself as its own activity, and that can survive a certain life form, so that we have the succession of, for example, world spirits. And why can spirit do that? Well, he says here, spirit provides its reality for itself insofar as it succeeds in forming a particular individual entity that breaks the circular course of nature. So spirit produces a certain type of reality. And I find that thought, by the way, very interesting. I should actually mark that because I want to use it later. So in that sense, spirit brings the time of the natural individual, of the life form, to an end. by mastering that time and producing something that goes beyond the time of the individual. And this figure we can maybe also apply to world history. We have the natural lifespan of world historical spirits that emerge and then end. And somehow spirit achieves to go beyond that if it understands itself. So we have an absolute spirit that understands how world spirits operate. For Hegel, this mastering of time is not a static moment or rigid eternal present in which time and history would have come to a standstill, but is itself a process in time, now conceived of as the time of spirit. So we enter here a new stage. Yes, so we don't need to read these details here. I want to go a bit further. But yeah, with spirit producing itself, right, it is the realization of itself as a free, self-conscious spirit. So we finally are, spirit is produced by people, so we are aware of that, right? And he gives an example: for a human being, getting old is like a gradual breaking free from time. The body, which is tied to the natural time, petrifies, but the spirit delivers itself from limited interests. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what this means here, but I think that, of course, like, we mature, but our spirit can supersede the aging of our body. Like, technically, I think we die already at the age of 25. That's where our youth is finished. But our mind is still developing. And I think in interaction with other people, we can that too. And then we have the formation of larger societies and nation states. So if we realize at a certain moment that we want freedom in our lives, right? Freedom from this natural time, we start making history, but we realize that we are still limited in our pursuit of individual freedom of making history. And like, I want to like that. And we see that a people does not make history until it makes itself free and organizes itself as a political state. So the requirement of freedom, even for people who organize them as a folk, a people, is not accomplished yet if they don't produce themselves in a certain organic unit. The history of a people is the realization of its own particular spiritual people, its own Volksgeist. The time which precedes that period is the people's prehistory. So is this absolute spirit now the closing of history? Well, Erb cites very famous quote of the owl of Minerva that starts its flight only at the coming of dusk, when time has ripened and exhausted in its flowering its power for rejuvenation and cultural development. Only then is philosophy able to hold up the concept of the contemporary world in its rational form like a mirror to the real world. So what we see here is that philosophy comes always too late. Philosophy cannot tell us what the future is about. It's a reflective instance. It does not have a direct role, as Erb says a little bit later. Philosophy is not the stimulant that the world needs for the realization of reason in its historical form as objective reason. It can happen, but we shouldn't overestimate its role. And I like that insight, because philosophers very often take themselves to be very important. So what then is philosophy's task? Well, it is to develop the conceptual understanding of the relation between the world spirits, what is the objective spirit, and the absolute spirit. Thus, it is the expression of the moment at which the objective spirit unbinds itself from its particular historical world and recognizes itself in this world as a moment of the absolute spirit, as expressed by art and religion. From this point of view, a mature philosophy is always that moment of a spiritual reality at which history closes itself, the moment at which the objective spirit as historical reality in full consciousness passes over into the sphere of the Absolute Spirit. So what is Absolute Spirit? Absolute Spirit is the self-realization of spirits to make themselves free, to recognize that spirit was always just its own making, and now understanding this own making, and thereby being able to produce its own reality. That is not a mind-independent reality, it's a reality that is produced by minds. And I think this is the central idea of Absolute Spirit that I try to defend. It's a relativist position. We build that on the plateau of what is given to us through our experience. But we don't claim that this absolute is absolute in the sense of being a god and predicting all future. It just understands the general mechanisms of history. And now it is open for these changes in another way. They won't happen contingently anymore, but they will happen in a way that we can expect them. Therefore, Erb also concludes in a final chapter, the Absolute Spirit cannot turn against reality. The absoluteness of the Spirit or its detachment from time does not mean it has disengaged itself from the world. Because of its eternal present, the Absolute Spirit does not necessarily involve the concept of the realization of its end as end within or at the end of time. It just realizes what are its possibilities. And it is open for a real history now to occur. And yeah, I want to close here, but just to state the last sentence that I saw to be significant, we must acknowledge that the realization of freedom as the end of history has not been completed in any way. So we are at that moment in time when we really understand ourselves as producing our own reality. We will be open for a future world to come. And this future world is not determined. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. This was my talk today. If you have any comments on that, if you disagree with that Hegel interpretation, please disagree. Leave it in the comments, right? That's no problem. This is a reading of a more historical Hegel, right? That you may not be used to, because the Hegel as I perceive it from the right-wing side, or maybe call it through the analytic rejection, is a Hegel who determines everything and who is not open for the future. I, however, follow more philosophers like Zizek, certainly controversial, or also Walter Jeschke, who was the main editor of the Hegel archives. I'm not entirely sure whether I'm in line with his position, whether he sees it similarly like me, but I was very inspired by his work to read Hegel in a more historicist sense. So yeah, thank you very much for listening until here. I guess if you listen until here, you can also subscribe or give me a like, leave a comment, and you can also go to my blog, because now I will actually have a podcast where I will discuss different subjects like these. So the first subject that I discuss is indeed related to more identitarian politics. I talked with Ken Ivory about his favorite book of James Baldwin, and I can really recommend that. It's a good idea of it's a good presentation of how the unexamined life is not worth living, and what we have to ask ourselves in terms of our predominantly maybe white culture. I mean, that's a controversial question too, but yeah, listen to these talks if you have time, or like try to find my podcast. Thank you very much so far. So I can just say, live long, be open for the future, and prosper.